Welcome everyone, and this will be our sixth talk in our Paleo Home ECR series. And those who don't know us, well, I'm Prachi Joshi, and we have Razika with us. Razika,
Hi everyone.
yeah. So, okay, so like always, we'll just give you a brief intro to our Paleo Home ECR online series, and then Razika will introduce you all to our today's speaker, and then we'll start today's session. So, well, we all know that Paleo Home is a project where we are looking forward to bring together the experts who are working in India, Africa, Arabia, Southwest and Southeast Asia, where we will try to address the issues related to chronology, paleo environments, and behavioral variability over the lower Paleolithic while exploring the similarities and also the differences in evolutionary trajectories. So, as a part of this same Paleo Home project, we are organizing this online session where we are organizing lectures by the early career researchers who are working on these various aspects of Lower Paleolithic. Through this series, we are aiming to create a network within ECR and who are working in these various regions, and we are really looking forward on a building collaborations for greater opportunities to discuss each other's work. So with this intro to Paleo Home project, now I will ask Razika to introduce all of us with our today's speaker. Razika, over to you.
Thank you, Prachi. Dear everyone, welcome everyone also for this discussion. In this session or in this presentation, we invited Dr. Rosa Moll. Is a postdoctoral researcher specializing in the earlier and middle Stone Age of South Africa and also East Africa, mainly in Tanzania. She earned her MSc and PhD in Archaeology from the University of Witwatersrand in 2017 and also for her PhD in 2022. Her research, which includes excavation work in the Cradle of Humankind, I think that you are lucky, provided invaluable insights into the technological advancements and behavioral patterns of early hominins populations. Dr. Moll's excavation experience extends beyond the Cradle of Humankind to iconic sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania and Wonderwerk Cave in the Northern Cape, in South Africa. In addition to her work in Africa, also she participated in different excavations and in various sites in France and Spain, contributing to our knowledge of the human dispersal and interactions in Europe. Throughout her academic career, Dr. Rosa Moll has collaborated with researchers from multiple countries, fostering a spirit of international cooperation and exchange. She has undertaken research stays at prestigious institutions such as University College of London for her PhD and the University of Toulouse, Jaures, for her MSc, where she engaged in interdisciplinary research on lithic or on stone age, in African context. I cannot take more time. I let Rosa, Moll, you are welcome, and we are excited to hear about South Africa and also Tanzania. You can start.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen. As Rosika said, my name is Rosa, and I am currently a postdoctoral researcher based at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to give a lecture or talk to the research group. It's very interesting what you guys are doing, and as someone who's very interested, and I'll talk a bit about in my talk, very interested in the regionality differences and similarities of the Acheulean and stone tool technology, it's very nice to meet and with researchers who work in the Asian subcontinent and various other places, and to talk about what we have in common when it comes to archaeology. So I just want to thank you. It's an honor to be here. So as you all saw, I'll be discussing my PhD and that I received in 2022. It's a lot of data, but I'm hoping to bring it down to, kind of manageable level. And obviously I won't be able to talk about everything as much as I would, otherwise we'd be here for 12 hours. But I'm hoping to give you an overview of some of the sites I looked at and what we can see about trends within the early Acheulean of Eastern South Africa. I also just want to give a thanks to various bodies that helped fund my PhD and my research, and as well as my supervisors, Professors Kathleen Human, Ignacio de la Torre, and Dominic Stratford, who were all very vital in me kind of completing and doing this research. So this is a very old, out-of-date kind of image of kind of the spread of Acheulean throughout Africa, Europe, and Eurasia. There's obviously a lot more sites and a lot more information that we have now, but I just wanted to use this as a kind of introduction to the spread of the Acheulean techno-complex as we understand it. It is an industry that, as we all know, emerged around 1.76 million years ago from East Africa, but is found across this area of the world and survived in some form or another for over 1 million years. And so it's one of the longest, it's the longest technological period that we have in human and hominid history. And it's one that provides us incredible information about technological behaviors, how they originated, how they adapted over time, how they became more refined, and how various areas around the world link to each other in terms of technological behavior. So going into my PhD, I was very interested in understanding how these specific kind of elements of technological behavior, most notably edge shaping and core management and reduction strategies, compared between different areas. And I used South Africa and Eastern Africa, generally speaking, as two kind of regions to compare and talk about. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be done with other areas. And I wanted to see if, when we broke things down beyond just pure typology and morphology, but actually looked at specific core reduction strategies and technological behaviors, how do these areas compare? So just a very broad overview of showing you the kind of sites that I focused my PhD on. So within Southern Africa, I looked at two main regions, which encompass 3 sites, which were Stapfontein Caves in the Cradle of Humankind, which I'll talk about. And then within the central part of Southern Africa in Northern Cape, I looked at 2 sites, Rietpoorts 15 and Kantinkopi. And then within Eastern Africa, I localized it to Olduvai Gorge, which we know is a huge site complex with numerous archaeological deposits, and had gone in with the intention of mainly looking at 2. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I ended up only looking at EFHR, and I'll go a bit more into it, but I'd hope to look at BK as well. But yeah, so there's always room for more research and more work to do. But just to give you an overview of where regionally my PhD was situated. As I said, within Southern Africa, I looked at 2 main regions. Within the Cradle of Humankind, is if you look in the top little box here, the Cradle of Humankind currently, there are 15 published archaeological and paleontological sites. Of all of those sites, 1 is purely archaeological. It's the site here on the western edge called Marapeng. There's no cave deposits, so there's no fossil hominids, because that's what the Cradle's known for. Cradle of Humankind is very much known for the fossil deposits that we have. If we consider all hominid fossils in the world, roughly 40% of them come from this 50,000 hectare area in South Africa. So it's extremely dense with masses of cave sites. And often archaeology is kind of second to the paleontology and paleoanthropology of the site. But it's extremely important archaeology because currently it is the oldest archaeology we have in South Africa. It comes from this region. And then when we move outside of the Cradle of Humankind, we are starting to find more and more Acheulean sites. Everyone knows South Africa is littered with archaeological deposits, but Acheulean, we are growing in the number of sites that are being currently published and being analyzed. And specifically within that earliest phase of the Acheulean, within the central part of the country, we have quite a few sites starting to come out. Because a lot of the Acheulean sites in Southern Africa, we can date towards like the later end of the Acheulean, but we have quite a few earlier sites now also within the central area. And two of them I'll be talking about are Kantienkopi and Rietpoets 15. So going into this PhD, these were the research questions that I had. I'm not going to read them out straight for you, but basically it was to do an analysis of these assemblages to try and understand the detailed core reduction strategies that hominids adopted to, as well as how they produced and shaped their LCTs. And then how do those specific factors and that specific information of core reduction and LCT shaping related to each other between sites? And is there commonality or variation between those outside of just kind of morphological and typological definitions and categories of artifacts? And what can this end up telling us about hominids and nappers and human evolution in general across the African continent? And then eventually, how can this be used forward, looking at other sites and other regions with Acheulean deposits? So this is not something I'm going to go into detail because everyone here has an introduction and an understanding of the Acheulean, but partly why the Acheulean, as I mentioned, is so important and of so much interest is because it is such a long running technological industry. And we have many sites within Africa and outside that are getting older and older with publications. Currently, as we know, the oldest dated Acheulean deposit comes from Kokisile 4 in Kenya. We also have sites at around 1.7 throughout Ethiopia. But then when we move to Southern Africa, we have quite old age sites, but we slightly younger than what you're finding in Eastern Africa. So Statfontein Caves, which I'll talk about now, the Acheulean deposit, at the moment it's currently being dated using various absolute methods. We've never been able to properly and accurately date the site, mainly because of the insane complexity of these cave sites, and I'll talk a bit about why they're so hard to understand. But there is an estimate that it sits somewhere between 1.6 and 1.4 million years ago. But along with kind of the long-standing presence of the Acheulean across the world, it's also it marks a huge shift both in technological and human evolution because there's suddenly this explosion in terms of the number of sites that we find compared to say the older one. And within Africa, certainly it's very much linked to the kind of evolution of Homo erectus / Agaster. I'm going to say I swap between the terms. There's debates about which, like Southern Africa versus East Africa, and which species. It's not really that important in terms of my research, but just so you know, within the literature, they both are used. So again, I'm not going to hark on this for long because everyone is very aware of these kinds of definitions. But when I'm talking about the earliest phase of the Acheulean, I'm really talking about that phase within the technological industry that we define as the Acheulean. So that earliest part from about 1.7 million to about 1 million, which is a very interesting time period to look at because it's, as I said, we've got that Homo erectus / Agaster, but we also start to see quite a spread throughout Africa and just out of Africa. So it's a very kind of dense period with the information that we have available to us. And again, I focused heavily on using kind of technological analysis following a chaîne opératoire kind of overarching kind of application. but then focused and zoomed in very specifically on kind of the core reduction behaviors, the specific decisions and steps taken within producing LCTs, shaping edges, as well as within core edge management and core volume reduction. So those are the key factors within the Chanel Prototype that I looked at. And so, yeah, so that's when all this data I'm presenting is very heavily involved in that. So it was much more of, say, a technological analysis of the production methods versus something like the functionality of these tools, which is also a whole other interesting question that can come out of this, but it was very much focused on the production methods. So the sites that we used for my site, for my analysis, some of them actually have multiple deposits because they're site complexes, but much smaller than what you would see at Olduvai Gorge. They're single sites with different locations. So the first being Sterkfontein Member 5 West. Sterkfontein is made up of a number of infill members, and that early Acheulean deposit is only localized to one of those member infills. Then Kanteenkoppie, one of the sites that we looked at, is actually, I'll show you through the map, is a larger area with multiple pits. And even within those, there are different kind of stratigraphic units which have been associated to within that 1.7 to about 1 million years old. So we looked at them as well as early Acheulean, but slightly different in time period. So there you'll see the basal layer and the organized core layer. I'll talk a bit more about those names. Again, similar with Rietkoets 15, it's an area that has multiple pits and deposits. So there's two main pits that were excavated that had this early material and showed some quite interesting things from both of them. And again, have slightly different ages based off cosmogenic nuclide dating, and also seen very, very close in location, but also had some slight differences based on age. And then finally, I looked at EFHR. EFHR is obviously a very well-known famous site from Olduvai Gorge, but I specifically analyzed an assemblage excavated under Ignacio de la Torre and Rafael Mora for their OGAP project, and published in 2018. So those are like the focus of the assemblages that I looked at for my thesis. Just to as a methodological note, I generally followed the same methodology as developed by De La Torre and Mora for their work. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that researchers try and understand kind of core management, edge reduction, volume control. I wanted to be very consistent with the application across all the sites because I wanted to make sure that methodologically there were no differences in the analysis, and so therefore any small differences we could see between sites, we wouldn't be based on kind of methodological questions or approaches that we use. So this could have been done using a range of different different methods, but these are the ones we focused on because I was very interested in looking at volume reduction and edge management, which the system allows researchers to kind of encapsulate in one. It looks, I know, very complicated, like a phone book with all its codes. You don't need to understand this for the sake of this talk. It's just to kind of talk about that we're looking at edge management and volume reduction, as I said, specifically when it comes to cores. And then when it came to LCTs, we wanted to focus on kind of edge shaping, is understanding the steps taken within shaping edges and how that would be similar and different between sites. So this is kind of the general very simplified versions of edge shaping that we use to define throughout the for my thesis. So we have bifacial alternating, which is this one over here. Bifacial, where you have, one side reduced than the other, unifacial shaping, and then what we ended up calling rhomboid shaping, which is where you have two sets of unifacial shaping that are opposite each other on different sides, and it ends up looking a bit like a rhomboid when you're looking at the kind of the top profile of the piece. Cool. So now I'm going to go very much into Sterkfontein caves. I'm going to just talk a bit about the data that we got from the site and show you some examples from each assemblage. So as I stated, Sterkfontein caves is located within the Cradle of Humankind. Often people conflate the two. Sterkfontein is one of the sites within the Cradle of Humankind. It's this large area outlined by the dark black line. And there's many famous sites in there that I'm sure many of you have heard of and read about. But when we're talking specifically about the Acheulean technology and what we know archaeologically from the area, The main sites are from this southern area down here, and they are Sterkfontein, Swartkrans. We've got some material from Kromdraai, and then we've also got Murruping, which I mentioned earlier. The only archaeological site is here on the western edge. It's not on this map. But so overall, there's fewer archaeological assemblages from the cradle that date to the general early Acheulean time period. But Sterkfontein, of all those, is the largest assemblage, and also from our estimates of age is probably the oldest or one of the oldest of the early Acheulean in this area. So Sterkfontein Caves has been excavated and researched for almost 100 years at this point. It's a very, very well-known site. And this is a bird's eye view of the exterior of the cave. So as I said, it's a cave system. It's quite a large cave system, but all the archaeological remains were found on this eroded outer section of the site. There have been some archaeological pieces found in the cave, but those we think are just kind of later infills through movement into the cave. So as I said, the cave itself is made up of a series of infills, and these are called members. And member 4, which you can see here on the eastern edge, is the member that we get all the Australopithecus africanus from the site from, which is, it's the site with the most fossils of Australopithecus africanus in the world, just to give you a sense. And then there was a huge hole that was partly eroded away, but also dug by Alan Hughes in the 1950s and 60s. And then on the eastern side of that, we have member 5. And member 5 is the infill in which we found many early Homo fossils from Sterkfontein, as well as both the older one and Acheulean deposits that we have within the site. So the older one comes mainly from the eastern edge of the member 5 deposit, and the Acheulean comes from the western side of the member 5 deposit. So when we specifically talking about the Acheulean, we talk about Sterkfontein Caves and member 5 west. If you've ever seen that and get confused, it's just to give you an understanding of how the cave forms. So because caves are very difficult to understand, and these caves in the cradle are caves that eroded underground and then opened up to the surface, basically material would fall in over time and get mixed up with conglomerates and basically create very kind of haphazard matrix within the cave formations. So a lot of there's no perfect, beautiful stratigraphy in these deposits. They're extremely hard to understand how different things fill in, erode over time, fill again. But what we can generally see through technological analysis of the artifacts, analysis of the hominids, looking at actually kind of the infills in the caves, we see a general split between the older one and the Acheulean deposits within the cave. And so that helps kind of define, like show a kind of chronology in the cave formation. This is actually from a thesis by Ray Cousins. It was published in 2021. It's very kind of complicated, interesting. He focused his entire research on truly understanding like where the borders of these deposits are. But this is a kind of general overview of the material from the site, based on a grid system that was implemented by Dr. Robert Broom, who in the 30s and 40s, which we still kind of follow to understand because all the material that we have in collections follows this grid system. So if we just move away from fossils and we talk about the very exciting archaeology, my favorite part of all of it, there is a very clear trend in the Cradle of Humankind in general, is that there are 2 main raw material sources for all the archaeological sites, being quartzites and quartz that are harvested and collected from the nearby Sterkfontein Valley River. And then from time to time, we have various other rock types coming in, mainly being chert and like igneous type rocks. But they really are, and this is for the older one, the Acheulean, across all these sites is very, very uncommon. And in Sterkfontein itself, we probably have, I think it's, if I remember, 2 chert pieces and 1 that we're not sure, it's a general igneous rock. But mainly we're looking at quartz and quartzites. One of the big shifts that happens from the older one to the Acheulean, specifically at Sterkfontein Caves, is that the proportions of quartz and quartzite swap. So in the older one, we have 2/3 to 3/4 of the assemblage is entirely quartz-based, whereas the rest is quartzite. And in the Acheulean, we start getting much more quartzite coming into the assemblage and fewer quartz pieces. So there's also a shift technologically in the raw material choices. And when we come to the cores, specifically within the early Acheulean of Stafontaine caves, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is a bit croaky. We see a heavy focus of expedient and multifacial reduction. Again, this is primarily on quartzites, and the quartzites from the cradle and from the river, which were collected and brought up to the Stafontaine site, tend to be quite large and blocky river cobbles and just pieces of rock that they found on the ground. There's not many smaller rounded pebbles within this area. So overall, there's this multifacial reduction of these blockier pieces that come from very, very close to the site, within about 1 kilometer. Most of the raw material is sourced. If you look at all the codes below, they follow that kind of system as I showed, that was developed by De La Torre and Mora. But if you look at everything with the B's here, except for bipolar, these are bifacial reduction strategies. And then we have unifacial reduction strategies here. TC stands for test cores, also known as casual cores, so pieces that have 1 or 2 removals, but we can't see a kind of overall core reduction strategy. And very much what we see in the early Acheulean of Stafontaine is that there is a much higher tendency to bifacially manage the edges of cores. And do this, and this was done very much along edges, natural edges of the cores that allowed, that gave really accessible napping platforms. And this is often what the shape of the raw material blanks that were collected had, is they are blocky, but tend to sometimes have quite more acute angles where they were able to nap both surfaces quite easily. So there's very little platform preparation and very little overall preparation within these core reduction strategies, but there is quite extensive core reduction along those edges, especially in a bifacial manner. We do have a few examples here and there of slightly more discoidal reduction in cores and alternating bifacial reduction, but it primarily is bifacial along a naturally shaped or a naturally available edge. But overall, cores were exhausted for all the natural platforms that were available to nappers. Hence, there's such a large proportion of multifacial cores in the assemblage. And then if we break it down, looking at the raw material, the blanks for the cores that we have, we as I said, we couldn't use terms such as cobble in terms of a stereotypical river cobble, because even though these come from the river valley, they're not rounded and naturally, as we imagine what a natural cobble or pebble looks like. They have some water and fluvial wear and tear on them, but they're overall very, very big and blocky pieces. So when we talk about blocky and rounded, we were referring to pieces that were large, like quite angular in shape, but the edges were very rounded, whereas you also got very large blocky pieces that had very sharp angular edges. And often what we saw is that sometimes it did kind of show a slight difference in the extensiveness of the reduction strategy. So when blocky angular pieces tended to allow for longer sequences of reduction along one edge or core edge management versus more rounded edges, just because hominids would exhaust that edge quicker when it was more rounded. So it's these factors of like core edge, of the shapes of the edges of the raw material and the blanks were very, very important and were very instrumental in the reduction strategies adopted by hominids at these sites. So here are just some examples of some cores from Stafontaine. These two pieces here that I'm showing are both quartzites. So firstly, if you look at them, you can see it's a very, very fine grain quartzite that we have in the cradle. This fine grain quartzite allows for beautifully sharp edges. So we've done a lot of napping and experiments with it, but it's incredibly hard to nap. So extracting large flakes requires a lot of force, versus the quartz, which is very kind of white, milky quartz that shatters very easily, is incredibly sharp, but doesn't allow for large flakes and large tools to be produced. So this, the big round blocky one on the edge is kind of very typical of what these cores look like in Stafontein and the cradle, in lots of these early Acheulean sites in the cradle. Is, as you'll see, there's like one kind of edge that was exhausted for as much as they could get off the natural kind of blocky shape of that edge. It was more kind of square, and then the more rounded side of this is actually a cobble from the river, wasn't napped, but often was used as a hammerstone. And this just little circle is to show where there's some evidence of hammerstone percussion. But then this piece on the right, this is a piece that we debated it heavily if it's an LCT or not. It's one that shows no specific shaping edges. They're large flake extractions, but it's made on large flakes, so it's one that is debated by different researchers if it is an LCT or a core. But what was interesting is that it was the blank was a large flake, and because there was a thinner edge going around the entire blank, they were able to have a longer exploitation of the edge, which we saw again on multiple cores, is that when there was these thinner, longer, sharper edges, they were able to have longer reduction strategies and core edge management strategies across the assemblage. We saw this very commonly. Here's another piece from the assemblage. As you can see, there's one side that is exploited. This, what we can see, was probably maybe a thinner or had more kind of a easily nappable edge. And the other side of the core, which is quite rounded and blocky, so it'd be very hard to nap with this very tough quartzite, wasn't used for flake reduction, but was used as a hammerstone, which again, we have pitting on the opposite side to the reduction, which is a very common trend as well within the Stafontein Acheulean. And then, as I said, we have a few very beautifully made, heavily exhausted, bifacially reduced pieces in the assemblage. This is quite a beautiful little, like hierarchical discoidal core, where you have preferential removals on a flatter side, but the whole piece had been shaped all around. And as we all know, even though the Acheulean is not an industry that is defined by prepared core technology, you know, following the kind of clear standard definition of that, but we do see the beginnings of a lot of this technology throughout Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and EFHR, these sites, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Then we're moving on to the LCTs and the kind of general shaping patterns that LCTs had in the site. So as I mentioned, we have quite a few cores from the site. We have 264 cores just from the Acheulean deposit. We have 19 LCTs. It's a very common trend within a lot of South African sites, the early Acheulean sites, is that we have a much heavier core assemblage than we do LCT assemblage. It's not fully understood why this is always the case. The main hypothesis is always that the LCTs were then removed from the site, but we don't often see the accompanying kind of production methods, except for at Canteen Kopi, which I'll talk a bit about. But the LCTs are very proficiently made at a lot of these sites. So specifically at Stafontein, we again had, we don't have many LCTs, but all the LCTs that we saw had a significant number of shaping edge scars on them. And a lot of it is bifacial shaping. And as I'll show you some examples, a lot of this bifacial and this heavy, extensive bifacial shaping, often in a bifacial alternate pattern, meaning flipping the piece between removals, was done on flake blanks and thinner pieces where the edge was longer and thinner across the piece, and therefore those shaping strategies could be more extensive on the piece. And then if you see down here, we've got the number of scars that would go with each piece. So what we were trying to show here is that with the bifacial alternating pieces, they were able to produce more flake scars on each piece than they would have with the other forms of edge shaping. So that reinforced this idea that as if there was a longer, thinner edge on the pieces available to the nappers, they were able to shape it for a longer sequence and therefore have more flake scars. So some of the pieces from Sterkfontein, as you can see, this is like a very crude hand axe that was made on a cobble piece, a rounded cobble piece, and had not many removals to shape the tool. As you can see, I think there's 5 prominent scars on this piece to kind of create the overall shaping. We were quite a bit more conservative with this site in terms of looking at specific small retouch pieces, because these pieces have gone through so much weathering and post-depositional processes. But even with that in consideration, there's very few edge retouch, very little edge retouch on these pieces. And overall, the shape of the tool was mainly being done through large shaping flakes, as indicated on this piece here. We also had larger pieces that went through extensive shaping. So this is quite a large LCT. It's the largest one in the assemblage. But it had a lot of reduction happening on this piece with more kind of retouch edge shaping. But overall, the edges that were available to nappers tended to be more acute than on this piece here, where it's quite blocky, but the edges are much more obtuse almost. Whereas on this piece, we can't tell what blank it is, but there were a lot more kind of thinner, acute edges available to nappers, and they were therefore able to more intensely shape this piece here. And then we also had some rather interesting LCTs from the site. This is quite a unique looking, like what we've called a knife with like a serrated denticulate edge, as you can see along here. It's made on a very large, thick flake, following primarily a unifacial shaping strategy on the kind of dorsal edge of that flake blank. But again, there wasn't a need for extensive shaping, specifically when they were getting when they were trying to create this denticulate edge, or down this other side here, because the edges, because they were quite thick on the lower parts of the core, as you can see here. Sorry, my throat's a bit croaky. On the lower part of the LCT, as you can see here. Whereas the thinner part of the flake, which is up here, you see that there's more shaping. So it's a very unique piece. It's a very unique shape. But what we can see again is that pattern of when the shaping or the napping platforms available to nappers was more acute and sharper, they were able to have these more longer and continuous reduction strategies. This is just a little piece to further demonstrate kind of the reduction strategies for the LCTs at Sterkfontein. This is a beautiful little side, a little LCT made on a large side struck flake. It has very few actual shaping scars on it to create a working edge, and the tip has also broken off. But it's one of the few ones where you had a thin edge opposite the direction of the flake blank, but it wasn't heavily reduced despite being quite a thin edge. So that also could indicate that sharp edges were being produced through the blank, and so there wasn't a need for heavy reduction. Okay, cool. So moving beyond Sterkfontein, I'm going to talk about Rietpoort's 15, one of the other sites in South Africa that I looked at. So as I said, Rietpoort's 15 is found in central South Africa, along the Vaal River, and it is not very close to Kantinkopje, which I'll talk a bit about next, but is kind of a site complex with multiple pits that have been excavated over multiple years. Rietpoort's 15 was discovered through diamond mining. So this part of South Africa is very heavy for diamond mining. And actually the way that the artifacts were collected from this excavation, from the pits 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, is the artifacts were collected off conveyor belts from diamond mining. So all this material would be dug up, because we, as the archaeologists, didn't have the permission to excavate those areas because of the diamond mining. And then artifacts, diamonds would be removed. And then right at the end, once all the diamonds had been removed, the archaeologists were able to go in and look through that material and find all the archaeological remains within there. So we have the locations of the 5 pits that go down to 5 meters deep. And we know that they're closer to the 5-meter deep section, but within that we don't have any kind of context information. The only pit within Rietpoort's that was like properly excavated by archaeologists is this one called Artifact Collection Pit, that they were able then to excavate many years after the diamond mining had finished in that location, and they went in. And I'll talk about Artifact Collection Pit and Pit 5. So this pit here and this pit here. So as I said, it came out of diamond mining. So these are, you got these areas that are up to about 18 meters deep. And as you can see here, this is, I think, if I remember correctly, is from pit 1. But the actual earliest Acheulean that we find is almost 18 meters below the ground. So even if we were excavating just as archaeologists, it would be almost impossible to have known the site existed unless we knew of the diamond mining in the area. So it's very much a catch-22 when it comes to diamond mining. So let's break it down then when we're talking about the artifacts and the technology at Rietpoort's 15. So Rietpoort's 15 is, if we look at this image here, is found along this Vaal River. So there's an enormous amount of cobble, river cobbles available to knappers. So almost all the pieces that we have here that artifacts are made on at Rietpoort's are made on these river cobbles. And there's quite an even distribution among the kind of raw materials that are available to hominids in the area. It's quite easy to walk along the riverbank and find quartzites, CCS, hornfels, Ventadorp lava, as well as quartz. These are all quite easily found in the area, and therefore they're quite commonly used by the knappers. But what you'll see is, again, there's a lot of quartzites, and the quartzites from the Vaal River are very similar to the quartzites in the Cradle. And so it's a lot of these very hard materials that create very sharp cutting edges. So we have overall from the artifact collection pit, we had about 98 cores from the pit that were collected. And but here we saw a very different reduction strategy overall to what we saw, say, in Sterkfontein. Here, pieces were much more bifacially reduced, but also there was a large proportion of bipolar reduction within the assemblage. And what we saw is this was often related to the shape of the raw material blank, so the cobble shape. So overall, we have a lot of smaller cobbles that were split often to then create edges for further napping, or then just split and used as bipolar pieces. But often, because pieces would be split, you tend to get, again, that sharper edge that nappers could easily work along over a slightly more continuous pattern, and therefore they would often use exploit those bifacially. As you can see, there's a large portion of bifacial with these V's down here. Exploitation versus unifacially shaped pieces. But because of the overall kind of rounded shape of the cobbles from the river in reed puts, there was nappers were often hindered to fully exploit the full surface of the cores, so we don't have many multifacial cores from this assemblage. And again, we were looking at the general shape of the raw material blanks for the scars, for the cores. And again, we had a very a heavy amount of rounded, like blocky rounded cobbles that were used with very rounded edges, which we would find very typically with these river cobbles. And as I'll show and talk a bit more about throughout the talk, this is very much linked to the reduction strategies and technological behaviors of the nappers. So this is just an example of one of the more heavily exploited cores from the artifact collection pit. The images I had were extremely blurry, so I took my very basic drawings from analysis here, so apologies for that. But I wanted you to be able to at least see the reduction strategy. But again, as you can see, there's a lot of exploitation, but the focus, we seem to have a focus along the kind of sharper edges of the cores. This is a typical thing, though, we see a lot. But where there are slightly more continuous edges to reduce, we see more bifacial and longer reduction strategies versus kind of the blocky, rounded sides of the cores, which aren't reduced as much. This is also not a great image, but another larger core from the assemblage, which had kind of shaping all along it, but was made on like a large chunk that was broken off of a larger core. And we had there was this bifacial edge management across the piece. Oh yeah, sorry. And what I forgot to mention at the beginning of the reed puts thing is that we were looking at the assemblages from both artifact collection pit and pit 5. However, we still have not found it after 7 years. We cannot find the pit 5 core assemblage. It has been missing now for about 10 years. We suspect we have discovered where it is, but we did not discover it in time for me to specifically analyze the cores from pit 5 as well as the LCTs. We have all the LCTs, we don't have the cores. So this is just the artifact collection pit core assemblage. But with the LCTs, we were able to look at both the artifact collection pit and from pit 5. So from following on, you'll see that I'm talking about 2 assemblages. So if we go into looking at the LCTs, following that kind of the shaping definitions that were set out in my thesis, we saw again there was a huge emphasis on bifacial and bifacial alternating reduction. So pit 5 itself, as you'll see, has a much larger assemblage than the artifact collection pit. The artifact collection pit also again only had about 18 or 19 LCTs, so there wasn't many. But whereas with the artifact, as in pit 5, we had, I think, almost around 60. So we also have a much biggest difference in assemblage size. But what was clear from both assemblages is that there was a heavy focus on bifacial edge shaping in terms of tool production for the LCTs. So here, this the top graph is from the artifact collection pit, and the bottom one is from the pit 5 deposit. So as you'll see that the main difference, even though there were similar edge shaping strategies between the artifact collection pit and pit 5, there is a very different distribution of raw material that is being used by hominids, specifically with an LCT production. So in the artifact collection pit, there is a heavy use of Fentersdorp lava Ventersdorf lava is one raw material that comes in much larger boulder type clasts. And so it was much more common for hominids to go in and just knock off large flake blanks that were then used for LCT shaping. And within the pit 5, there's a more kind of varied use of raw material. But again, there's a lot of Ventersdorf lava being used. So hominids were targeting these boulder cores, getting large flakes, and then shaping those and having quite extensive bifacial edge shaping strategies among these pieces. But within pit 5, there was also a tendency for hominids to collect river cobbles that were shapeable into LCTs. So there's a slight difference between those two assemblages. With the one interesting thing, but this might also just be dependent on the assemblage sizes, is that the pit 5 is slightly older than the artifact collection pit, and there's a bit more variety in raw material sources at the pit 5. So we're looking into it. It's at the my current hypothesis is that it's more just the location aspect of what hominids were collecting versus kind of a specific kind of choice to have a large expanse of larger set of raw material types. But as I'll talk a bit more about canteen copy as well, Ventersdorf lava is a very good material for LCT production, and I'll go a bit more into that. So this is some of the examples of the LCTs that we have from Witwatersrand 15. These are pieces from pit 5, the artifact collection pit. And this material here is the Ventersdorf lava. So this is what Ventersdorf lava is. It's very gray, fine grain, very hard material. It's very, very hard to nap this type of material. But here, as you can see, there's a large, the piece is made on a large side struck flake with very minimal shaping to create a working edge. And it's a cleaver based on the fact that it's a large side struck flake with a transversal edge at the top that hasn't been shaped, if you're following that definition of cleaver. So overall, this is a very common trend with the Ventersdorf lava, as I'll talk a bit about as we go through it. Then this is a piece from the site that was made on a cobble. It's an LCT hand axe that was made on a cobble, and the tip has broken off. That's why it's flat at the top here. This is just a clean break. There's no, it's not a shaped or a flake scar. But it was quite a flat, angular cobble that they were able to extract large flakes off of to get a working edge all around. So in order to create a working edge, they found a flatter cobble and reduced it quite heavily. But again, most of the time they had these flake blanks that had quite sharp natural edges to them. Sorry, what I was saying, this one is from Artifact Collection Pit. This is from Pit 5, just as some examples. There's a lot more examples I can show. I didn't include them all here just for time's sake, because I've still got 2 more sites to talk about. And then we're going to talk about canteen copy. Canteen copy and Witwatersrand 15 are not that far from each other. I think it's under 100 kilometers away from each other, but they both sit along the Vaal River. So compared to, say, Stadfontein, they're closer to each other, and so they have very similar raw materials and a very similar landscape and context in which these sites are found. Again, canteen copy is a site that has there was extensive diamond mining occurring, and there are multiple pits throughout the area where we have found archaeological material. But since then, archaeologists work at the site, and there are quite a few specifically excavated archaeological pits that we look at. And I was looking very heavily at pit 6, which is over here. So there's many other areas and pits to look at. But pit 6 is where I focus my research. It's one of the larger pits in terms of the amount of material that we have available to us, and it's quite a large excavation in and of itself. compared to the other pits. So if we look within pit 6 itself, there have been quite a few layers defined by people who have researched the site. George Leader, for his PhD and master's, looked at these sites in the Vaal to try and stratigraphically kind of contain the layers within them to see if we can get dates and general definitions of the technological signatures of these layers. And specifically within Pit 6, there are 4 main stratigraphic units, and 3 of those units he and dating generally has put within that 1.7 to 1.6 to 1 million year range. These are the basal the basal early Acheulean layer, as he's defined it, and then the organized core technology layer, and then above that is the Victoria West layer, and then we have more later assemblages from the Acheulean. But those 3 units, the basal, the organized, and the Victoria West, all fit within that 1.7 to 1 million year range. Specifically for my thesis, I didn't look at the Victoria West assemblage because we wanted to kind of look pre that. I'm not going to go heavy into detail about the Victoria West. We can talk a bit about it, but it's often called the kind of precursor to all formal Levallois and other prepared core technologies that we see within the Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic. But what we wanted to fully understand is how what the core reduction strategies and technological behaviors were of hominids just before that emergence of the Victoria West industry. So in the basal part, which dates to about 1.5 million and is shown here by the pie chart A, it's again incredibly dominated by the Ventersdorp lava, both in core reduction and in LCT production. Then when we go into what was defined as the organized core layer, we have more raw materials emerging, but there's still a heavy focus on this Ventersdorp lava. And the Ventersdorp lava is a very, very interesting raw material because we've been able to have a lot recorded from it, and it's quite unique among these sites, as I'll talk a bit about, because we actually have LCT cores, which we don't have in any of the other sites. So if we're just looking at the core reduction strategies between the 2 assemblages, the blue here represents the organized core layer, the basal is represented by the orange. There is a slight difference within the kind of dominant strategies that we see. So as I said, the basal is dated currently to around 1.5 million. The organized core layer is dated to about 1.3 million. So there's a slight shift within the technological strategies, overall technological strategies of core management in this one unit, because they overlay each other exactly. So within the organized core layer, we see a more heavy focus towards bifacial management of core edge, and I'll talk a bit about this, but specifically kind of volume control of the 2 edges, because we start to see quite a few cores that have preferential removals on one side. As I stated, we get a few pieces that come out of sites like Stackfontein, and in the organized core layer, it becomes very significant throughout the core assemblage. Hence, Mike Leader defined it and called it the organized core layer. Then within the basal layer, we see a lot more kind of multifacial and opportunistic exploitation of the cores. There are often a lot of similarities between when we do have bifacial pieces, but overall hominids in the basal layer were exploiting the cores as much as possible across all the surfaces available to them, rather than focusing on managing and maintaining a bifacial edge across the piece. And we also have a much larger variety of shapes that were available to hominids within these 2 layers and for their core reduction strategies. Again, this is a river site, but the cobbles here, specifically when it comes to the Ventersdorp lava, these are boulder cores. I'll show you some images, but these cores go upwards of 20 kilograms each. They're massive boulder cores that were found along the edge of the river. And a lot of them have very angular edges to them. They're heavily weathered and rounded, but both in the past because of the movement of the Ventersdorp lava, but it's also evident today of how much weathering these pieces have been exposed to. But the main thing, the difference that we see is that within the basal layer, there was a heavier focus on the boulders and exploiting the edges of the boulder cores as much as possible. Whereas when they started getting into the more organized core technology layer, there was a higher selection of smaller cobble pieces and longer continuous kind of edge management, certainly bifacially of the pieces. So there's a slight shift in what kind of raw material shapes hominids are adapting to, because this is generally within the similar, the same raw materials, mainly being that Ventersdorp lava. So there were cobbles, but the boulder cores were more exploited in the basal layer, and then smaller pieces tended to be more exploited within the organized core layer. So here, this is a piece from one of the few small pieces from the basal layer, smaller cores, which was a split cobble, which was heavily reduced all along the edge to extract as much as possible. So as you can see, this one is actually quite a nice, like bifacially managed piece, but most of the removals are on one side versus the other. Just to note, you can see how rounded these edges are from weathering, and there's a lot of natural damage on these pieces. So we often had to also be quite conservative in our description of like retouch on a lot of these things, because there's just so much damage and weathering on these pieces. Often you just can't tell as well. But what you can see here is there's quite a continuous edge management of this core. But then, as I said, you also get very, very large pieces. So this is one of the boulder cores that we have from the basal layer. It's a very, very flat boulder piece. This isn't like a large flake or anything. It was just quite a flat boulder. But you can see that because there were so many edges available, they reduced as much as they possibly could of this large boulder piece. So this is a very common trend that we see within the core management of smaller and bigger cores at Kantingkopi, which is also similar to what we saw in edge management at the other sites, is that when they had an edge that was more acute available to them, they would exploit it much longer, generally speaking. They would have a longer reduction strategy along that edge versus with more thicker edges available to them. And this is an example again of another boulder core that we have where there is quite a successful bifacial reduction of one edge, but only of one edge because it's too thick on the rest of the boulder. As you can see, it's very, very large. This is 10 centimeters. And yeah, so this was, I think, like a 30 centimeter large boulder. There are 5 extractions on the entire core, but they are all large flake removals on one edge only. And if you look, it's a very triangular kind of shaped boulder, which if you walk around Canteen and just look at the natural boulders that are unnapped, they very commonly look like this, where they're quite triangular in shape. And hominids were repeatedly going for these thinner edges on these triangular boulders, removing a few large flakes and then leaving the boulder as is. It's a very common trend in both the basal and the organized core layer when they were using boulder cores. And then this is actually from the organized core layer. Again, it's a very large flake that had still a boulder by definition, just of the size. Anything that was above 20 centimeters at its longest, but we were using that as like a marker. It had a very, very rounded cobble edge and another kind of pointy angular side, and there were a few removals, 3 in total of this piece, and then the piece was abandoned. But those extractions were very large and very successful in the sense of extracting large flakes with sharp edges. There was very little step hinge fractures on these flakes. They were very successfully removed from the boulders. And then when it came to the LCTs, we wanted to kind of see how the LCTs compared specifically to the core reduction at Canting because we have such large cores with such large flake removals. And as I'll talk a bit about the flakes, you'll see about the LCTs, they are almost exclusively made on Ventersdorp lava on large flakes. So it's the one site where we've been able to state that we think there's a very, very clear link between the LCT production and the core edge and the cores at this site, which is not a very common thing. We don't have many Acheulean sites where we have LCT cores. And within South Africa as well, it's one of the only sites I can think of where we can directly link cores to LCTs. So again, the first one is looking at this, on the left side is looking at the basal layer and then at the organized core layer. Between these two layers, there's virtually no difference in technological behavior in LCT production and shaping. The only difference really that we see is that there are like two quartzite LCTs found in the organized core layer, whereas we only have the hornfells. Only have we only have the Ventersdorp lava, which is it says andesite, that should say Ventersdorp lava, and some hornfells pieces, which are all these like very fine-grained hard material. But so even though we saw that slight shift and change in the core production and the core edge management, we see very similar trend in the LCT shaping and the LCT production from that basal layer to the organized core layer. So here we have, also to reinforce that there's a lot of similarity between these. We looked at all the metric measurements of these LCTs. And again, the kind of size range and weight of the LCTs is very, very similar between the two assemblages. So it makes sense that because we have a lot of these boulder cores that are exploited in the exact same way from the basal to the organized core layers, the LCTs follow a very similar trend as well, because they're being, the flake blanks are being produced in the same way. So we have the same size and kind of volume of the pieces, virtually the same across the sites. And then again, we have a focus on flake blanks between the two assemblages. And the only thing is that within the organized core layer, we have a few pieces that are more heavily reduced. So we don't actually know what the blank is, but it's overall, we see a consistent production of large flakes that are turned into LCTs. So here, this is from the basal layer. It's just some, as you can see, just some of the examples of the LCTs that we have. As I said, they're very similar. You look at them, they're all large side-struck flakes that are turned into cleavers with transversal edges and a bit of shaping on either, on the lateral edges of the piece. It's very, very common. And this continues, as I said, from the basal to the organized core layer. This is a piece from the organized core layer. Again, if you look at it in comparison to the basal, yes, they're not exactly the same morphologically, but they all have that same large side-struck flake, transversal, kind of rounded, natural edge. And this is 90+% of the assemblage for both of these layers. And then yes, we do get some pieces that are made on, like, say, cobbles. This is like a larger shaped piece that has a lot more shaping around the edge, but it's heavily weathered and rolled. So it's really hard to kind of see what the blank of this piece was, if it really is just like a flake blank, like a dorsal ventral surface, or if it's just a natural surface. It's really hard to tell. But as you can see, when they had edges that were thinner and could be exploited, they did do that. But overall, this is what the majority of the LCTs look like. And then once in a while, as I said, within that organized core layer, you've got a few more heavily reduced pieces. This is probably the prettiest Tandax that we have from the assemblage. And this piece differs significantly to these ones. These are all lava, the Ventersdorp lava. This is a hornfels. So it's also a different raw material, which means that it also was a very different size range of class available to hominids, because the hornfels comes in smaller class to what we see with the Ventersdorp lava. But yeah, it's just one of the really pretty pieces that we have from the organized core layer. So hominids were very capable of making these very much more refined, pretty LCT types like this hand axe here. But as I said, the majority and the kind of common technological behavior we see is this extraction of large flake blanks from fenchelstop lava boulders that were then minimally retouched to create cleaver LCTs. Finally, last site before we get on to kind of the general discussion, I know I've been talking for a while, is EFHR. EFHR needs no introduction. It's probably the most well-known or talked about, one of the most well-known early Acheulean sites. It is the type site of the early Acheulean. And it is found within Olduvai Gorge. It's located here along kind of the eastern main part of the gorge. If any have been there, it's absolutely beautiful. If you ever get a chance to go to Olduvai Gorge, I highly recommend it. And as I said, it's a site that was excavated by Mary Leakey in the 60s and 70s and published in the Olduvai Volume 3 book, and then was re-excavated under Professors Ignacio de la Torre and Rafael Mora for their OGUP project, their Olduvai Geology and Archaeology project. I think that's the name. And this is just the image here on the right is just kind of an image of the site and the excavation from which I'm specifically talking about and the assemblage that I'm presenting today. So we're suddenly moving to a very different region of the continent to what we had in South Africa. As I said, we hoped to also have BK, but unfortunately due to COVID, I was unable to access that assemblage. So we have a very different types of raw material in East Africa to what we have in Southern Africa. So here what we see is we start having a lot more kind of basalts, phonolites, trachytes, these kinds of volcanic rocks that we get in East Africa. But within the core assemblage specifically, the distribution is there's a heavy focus on the basalts for core reduction, but there's a large presence of all those raw materials within the core assemblage of EFHR. Excuse me. And compared to the other sites, and again, using that same approach of studying core edge management, it's a slightly different pattern to what we've been seeing again at the other sites. We have a lot of multifacial reduction and kind of heavy exploitation of pieces, but overall we see a heavy focus on bifacial, quite what we call a bifacial abrupt here, and bifacial alternating reduction. And I'll talk a bit about that. So it's again, there's a heavy focus on reduction that follows the natural shape of the edges of the raw material blanks available to nappers, and that often dictates what the overall reduction strategy of each core is based on that shape of the raw material. And this also goes across the raw material types that we have at EFHR. Again, if we look at kind of the general shape, as I've been discussing, of the raw material, we have again a very heavy focus on very blocky pieces with rounding, again coming from the river valley, but it's but the reduction strategies are focused heavily on that kind of overall shape of the edges of the raw material available to the nappers. So here's one of the cores from EFHR. This is one of the basalts. Again, you can see there's a focus of reduction and edge management on one side of the piece, and on the opposite side, where it was quite rounded, the piece was used as a hammerstone, akin to what we see at Statfontein. Very, very similar strategies. Here we have quite a blocky piece. It was a large cobble that was split, and that was used as the blank. And as you can see, the reduction or the core edge management is focused on that part of the cobble where it was split, but it was a very abrupt, a very right angle on the core. And so the reduction was focused very heavily on that right angle shape along the core, where the rounded part of it, where there aren't very easily accessible natural platforms, was not exploited. Here's another basalt piece where, again, as you can see, it's made on a cobble. where the one side was exploited, used quite heavily in a bifacial manner, and then the opposite end was rounded and not exploited, and potentially also used as a hammerstone with some pitting. So there's this consistent trend within the core edge management, is that hominids were exploiting natural edges, like the fresher, kind of less rounded edges of raw material clasts and blanks as much as they could. And when they had slightly thinner, more acute edges, say on this cobble compared to this blocky cobble, the sequence was often longer. Even if it was confined to one side, it was a slightly longer sequence. They were aiming to reduce it as much as possible. Then we moved on to the LCTs, and the LCTs at EFHR can be quite different, have quite a different signature to the cores, specifically within kind of raw material choices. And as you can see, this is of 100 in situ LCTs that we looked at, is 50, exactly 50 came from trachytes. Now, the main thing that the trachyte has over the quartzites and the phonolites and the basalts is this overall just bigger class that things came from. So they were able to kind of make large cutting tools from larger class. Whereas like the basalts and the quartzites and the phonolites tended to be slightly smaller cobbles. So they weren't used as much in production of these larger tools. So again, we have a kind of heavy focus on bifacial and alternating reduction and edge management within the LCTs from EFHR. And we also have a lot of unifacial shaping. So the edge, often if it was a thinner edge, allowed for them to have these very long bifacial alternating sequences. And I'll show some images here, because unlike Canteen, this assemblage is beautifully preserved, and we can see a lot of the flake scars and a lot of kind of the remains of the production process on these LCTs. And we see these very long and continuous reduction strategies because the shape of the edges of the LCTs tended to allow for them to be quite continuous and extensive. And if we just look at the general blank types for the LCTs, it's majority flake blanks. So that goes hand in hand with that, talking about having a long, kind of more acute, sharp edge available to nappers for longer shaping sequences. It relates heavily to these flake blanks. So here's one of the pieces from the assemblage. And often what you'll see, and because we have such high preservation on these pieces, the shaping sequences mostly began towards the base of the LCTs and moved upwards towards the tips in a bifacial manner on either side of the piece. So there was like two sequences of shaping from the base up to the tip, often following a bifacial and alternating pattern. Here again, we see a similar thing on a large cleaver. This is a large flake. You can see some cortex remaining here, was taken off a large trachyte boulder. And again, we have mainly unifacial, but again, a sequence that follows from the base of the piece up towards the tip. As it's a cleaver, it's not heavy, it's not shaped at the top, but you can see that same pattern going upwards of the pieces, and this kind of pattern that was used following the kind of natural shape of the flake blank. Here's a very beautiful piece from the excavation. Again, it's like a knife with a denticulate edge made on a large flake. And again, we can see, because of the preservation, we're able to see the order of removals, and you can see that there is a focus of a unifacial shaping on one side to get this beautifully like large denticulate edge, whereas the other side, which we imagine might have been used for handling, there's a slight bifacial reduction, but again follows from the base of the piece up towards the top. And finally, this is more one of the, if I remember correctly, one of the trachyte or quartzite pieces. It's one of the only pieces that we have in the assemblage where the shaping goes basically all around the piece, the shaping of the tool. So it starts up towards the tip of the one on the one side and moves all the way around the piece back up to the other edge. And this is a very beautiful sequence where you can see the flake scars going one after another around the whole piece, because the entire shape of the piece is, the edge all around is a very, very, well, the edge that was exploited followed a very similar kind of shape pattern. The scars were removed in a very uniform way, the flake scars. And so that overall shape of the flake blank allowed for this continuous exploitation over the whole piece, which it's really quite a cool piece to look at, because you can easily follow that sequence along the whole thing. So let's just talk about the big thing is, how do we actually compare these? How do we understand these reduction strategies? Because we can talk about all of these sites having clear early Acheulean signatures based in the tool types and the core reduction, but how do these specific factors of core reduction and LCT shaping compare to each other? So this is just some principal component analysis of the assemblage. As you can see, the two canteen copy assemblages, which are represented by the red and the green here, are huge outliers, mainly because of the size of those pieces, because they're made on those boulder cores. So when we looked at, I actually extracted those to have a better look at kind of the overall, the differences between the sites. So if we remove canteen copy as a site, just to have a better look, you can see that there is overall quite a lot of overlap between the core reductions and the core management shape. There's not a huge kind of fluctuation, because all this kind of variability often relates to the size of the canteen copy material. But if you look at it, all these sites are quite similar in how these components are evident at each site. So actually, the core edge management, the core reduction strategies between these sites are very, very similar. And the main kind of contributing factors and differences that we can clearly see are like the raw material types and the kind of overall shape and size of the raw material. But the actual strategies by which they're exploiting and managing the core edges, managing volume, is similar between and overlapping and quite common between these assemblages. And then if you broke that down further into like a basic component analysis of these factors and these shaping, like these edge management strategies, even though the edge management is similar, it's when you break it down into the general kind of components and the overarching kind of core reduction strategies, you see a slight difference between the assemblages. So the sites such as Sterkfontein and Canteen Copy, the basal layer, which are said to be two of the older layers within the assembly, within the study, tend to focus towards more of a multifacial reduction. Whereas with Reed-Putz 15, EFHR and Canteen Copy, the organized basal layer, we start to see more of a focus towards bifacial edge management. So more of a consistent edge management of the core assemblage versus kind of trying to exploit as much as possible on raw material blanks. So even though the edge, like the actual edge, like edge management strategies are very similar, the overarching kind of reduction strategies are slightly different. And again, if we looked at then the LCTs, we've talked a lot about how they're similar edge, like the shaping strategies are very similar, but within each assemblage, there's quite a lot of difference. So if you look here, we've got, oh, sorry. So if you got like, you can see that there's almost quite like a difference between the different colors of the sites. So here we've got the artifact collection, Reed-Putz 15, the yellow, sorry, I'm just checking. Oh yeah, again, this doesn't include Canteen Copy. The main reason we don't have Canteen Copy here is because there's a lot of information, as I said, we couldn't understand, and we wanted to be like, look as much as possible, but also the size ranges were throwing off the data quite a lot. And so we're still actually looking at a few pieces, so that's still something under study. A lot of the LCTs from Canteen are still under study. But as you can see here, there's quite almost a separation of the LCTs from the artifact collection pit to the pit 5, to Sterkfontein and EFHR in the red. So even though the edge management strategies are very similar, like the shaping strategies are very similar, we start to see quite a difference between the sites based on raw material types, raw material shapes and sizes. So when you have sites that you have a lot of cobbles available to you, you tend to have more of a thicker array of pieces, such as with artifact collection pit, when we had more cobbles, versus something like EFHR, where we had a lot more flake blanks, and there you could see much more of a similar kind of strategy among producing all the LCTs. Whereas when you have things like more thicker shaped cobbles, there's a bit more variety in the edge shaping and LCTs produced at the site. And then Statfontein, because it doesn't have many pieces, but has a range of both flake blanks and cobbles, sits kind of in the middle where it has all these factors, but it's because of the different kind of LCT blank shapes available to them, there's more variety in the edge management strategies. So again, it follows that kind of idea that even though specific edge management strategies are very similar and shaping strategies are very similar, the differences we've seen between these sites are more kind of raw material and context dependent. And again, we see that, like, Statfontein, as I mentioned, sits a bit like off from the others, but there is a very clear shift from like bifacial pieces at the Rietpoets 15 site to EFHR, which is closer to more unifacial, bifacial alternating and rhomboid shaping. And again, from my thesis, my conclusion is that's heavily related to the edge shape. So the original shape of the edge of the piece that was then, manipulated to create the tool, that is that defines and dictates the overarching strategy that is adopted to shape the piece. So just a general overview of what I tried to say with my thesis and what I hope kind of came across today in my croaky voice talk that I'm giving, is that when we're talking about these specific factors of core reduction, so very much looking at core edge management and LCT shaping, specifically within like edge shaping, the shape of the blank of that piece heavily dictates how shaping strategies and reduction is applied. So hominids often fit their mapping and technological behaviors within the confines of the shape of the material. Obviously, as we saw, there's examples of where they break through and they make much different things. It's not to suggest that hominids were incapacitated to move beyond a certain point, but often when you're looking at the overall technological trend, it fits within this idea that shape of blanks is very important to understanding overarching core reduction and edge shaping management. So when we're actually talking about the differences between these sites, the differences that emerge in the assemblages come from the context the sites are found in. So the raw materials available to them, what they look like, and which ones are collected. But when you're breaking it down to actual specific technological behaviors of saying how hominids dealt with different kinds of shaping or edge management strategies, they were using similar strategies. It just was dependent on how they applied that across the different contexts available to them. And then the final point, and one that came up through the work, but is not one we were able to answer because it's a much broader question, and one that I hope through my, to continue looking at in terms of my research, is this question of kind of progression within specifically this earliest phase of the Acheulean. How do core edge management strategies and LCT shaping change from sites that date to older than 1.5 million, as we saw with sites like Statfontein and the Canton-Corpy basal layer, to slightly younger but still early Acheulean deposits at around 1.3 million, which we see more with the Rietpoets artifact collection pit, the organized core layer Canton-Corpy, and as well as EFHR. So it's this question of maybe there's even progressive changes within that time period, but and are incremental. And you can only really understand when we're looking at these specific kind of individual or like small nuanced factors of core reduction and technological analysis. So there's a lot that we still need to look at, a lot we still can understand about this time period. But I hope that this kind of adds to the larger discussion of knowing that the Acheulean itself is not kind of it's not a monolithic, for lack of a better term, like idea of everything is made and to be exactly the same throughout almost 1 million years. It's that even if they were making very similar artifacts and using similar strategies, there is a lot of nuance and a lot of difference between these regions and these sites. Cool. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you all listening to me waffle on about my research.
Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you.
So important, interesting to have this discussion on the Acheulean of different sites. Okay, this is the first, different also, how to say it, accumulation, open air site, cave also. Okay, and I don't know if we have questions. Okay. Hi, Prachi.
Yeah, any questions from audience? Or
Hi,
would like to
Prati,
say-
Radhika.
yeah.
I just
Hi.
want to say,
Hi.
hi, I'm Shanti here. I'm sorry, I was traveling, so the network was really bad. But I really thought this was a fabulous talk, one of the best I've ever heard on the Acheulean, and it's really fantastic. So I think there's a huge scope for us to look at similarities between your sites and the sites we are working on in South India. In terms of the core reduction strategies, Dr. Achilles and Dr. Prachi are currently working on the core technologies at some of the sites in this region, and I'm sure they'll get in touch with you for more discussion. Also, I've been reading your work over the years, and I'm really interested in your organized core technologies, the differential distribution of boulder cores, and your theories about the origins of more prepared cores. So that's something we would love to discuss with you also later. Thank you again. I don't know how clear I am because the network is really bad and I'm outside office, but I really enjoyed it. Over to you, Prachi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Papo.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to say I completely agree. I think there's so much scope for people to fully understand how the Acheulean moves across, how does technology translate and move across a landscape, which your research group obviously is very focused on, is this out of Africa into Asia. And it's like, if you see these similarities, it's like, that you can look at kind of the origins or start asking questions about how things move and are used across the landscape. It's a very exciting part of the field. Yeah.
Yes. We
Yeah,
completely agree
exactly.
with that.
So important. Yeah. For
Radhika,
me,
would
just
you like to ask something? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
just one point, Rosa, for the how to say it, for the first, not the first, the second slide, and your PowerPoint, just in Hanish, the site of Olduvai site from North
Yeah.
Africa is not in Near East. You
Is
point.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just mistake. Okay.
That was very much I was looking for a picture.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Don't
didn't
worry.
do the
Okay.
thorough, but thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay. I have small questions, okay, because I think we took a lot of time for this
Yeah.
session. Just I saw some artifacts, okay, eroded. I don't know if they are transported by you or the condition of the caves. Maybe it's like chemical.
Which are you talking about? From which site?
The first is the F. Maybe.
Oh,
It's
Sterkfontein.
Sterkfontein. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there's a lot of general erosion that happens. The site, because it's this cave site, that everything gets mixed, and the way artifacts come to be into the site is they've rolled on the surface over time and fall into the deposit. So they get damaged quite easily. But even since with excavation, because excavating in the sites is the materials basically, like the matrix is concrete, it's natural concrete. So early excavations were hammer and chisels, and just they broke through and pulled up blocks. So there's a lot of damage on those pieces. Yeah. Unfortunately,
it's like
one of the things.
Just for the there is some fauna in association to these artifacts or lithic artifacts.
So at Reetputs 15 and Kantenkoppie in the Vaal, there's very little fauna because they're these river airbed sites that are open. So a lot of the organic materials were eroded. But at Sterkfontein and EFHR, there's a lot of fauna associated. The fauna associated at Sterkfontein is the reason that we have a relative age of 1.6 to 1.4 based on, if I remember correctly, the equid species that are found in the site.
Yeah.
And then at EFHR, obviously, there's a huge amount of fauna found within Olduvai Gorge. And and I don't know enough about the fauna to talk heavily to it, but we do see, but there is those are the sites where we can actually talk about associations. And interestingly, in the Olduvai, we also start getting associations around the early Acheulean in general throughout the Olduvai with like larger fauna like hippos as well. So there's a lot, I think, that can also be looked at into that and how, hominids were making tools in association and, in their context. Yeah. But unfortunately, I don't know enough about the fauna. Yeah.
I think that Prachi?
I'll just say a few things like fascinating work and really very good work. Like and like
Thank you.
Shanti
That's
said,
very nice.
I'm like whole time I'm just looking at the course which you are showing and the slides and the course which just they're here on our table, and I'm like, oh, they are just like us. They're just like us. And I'm like, yeah, so like I really would like to discuss with you further about like more about the technology and all about the course, small flake course versus the
Absolutely.
large. Yeah, so we'll discuss it more in detail in near future, and let's think about something like it's fascinating. You have done a lot of work, and just a
you.
small question which I would like to ask
exactly.
you is, this like you have large flake reduction and small flake reduction both going on, maybe simultaneously or maybe overlapping each other. Do you see any similar techniques which are used on small cores and also on a boulder cores?
I would say they're very similar strategies, particularly,
Yeah.
and it often boiled down. So say if we use Kantenkoppie as an example, which had the boulder cores and the small cores, if they were using, say, like a continuous bifacial alternating strategy, it was because the edge kind of angle was the same on those pieces. So even though they're much smaller flake scars and an edge, the strap, like the management was the same. It just was dependent on that shape, that angle of the edge. So yeah, so you do see a lot of similarity between that.
Okay, perfect. Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also when you are saying this flaking, it's more towards the edge of the cobble, or when it's on the peripheral, right? So why, like coming back to the debate of core versus core form or the chopping
Yeah.
tools or bifacial choppers. So would you like how do you justify them as a core and not as a working edge with a chopper?
Yeah. It's a hard one to do, and it's one that I honestly I kind of avoided in the thesis because I didn't want to get into that debate, because in my opinion, it was like if it was used, it's a functional question, but the production could be the same.
Exactly.
And I didn't necessarily see a difference in what, if you follow like Mary Leakey's core types, she has all those core tools that they actually made in the same way as just like her bifacial choppers. And so it is one where it's like sometimes I'm pretty sure they could have been used, and they, especially on the pieces where it's like a nice bifacial chopper and then it's been like a hammerstone on the other side. They must have used something like that, but it's so hard to show that, to demonstrate that. So it is a question that I find fascinating, but as I said, it's one that I didn't attack because I don't think I can answer that question with just this material. It's a really hard question, and I agree, it's one
Yeah.
that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, like looking at this course, we are like all three of us, Akhilesh, me, and Shanti, we are debating these questions like basically every day. And
No, it is. It's
yes,
one of those,
so
and then you see it's like if it's just me creating a strong, it's not very deep. The raw material
yeah,
that's like a thick edge, but
exactly.
it's sturdy, and it's like it's
Why
there's so
not?
many questions, and yeah, but
Yes,
it's one we can discuss because I think it's one that's valuable
exactly.
to
Yeah.
try and answer. Yeah,
So yes, so I think we should really meet after this session sometime
absolutely.
in future, and
Yeah,
should really discuss about these technologies.
Oh no, I'd love to. Yeah, because I'm
Yes,
fascinated to also see all the stuff from India. I think it'd be
yes,
so cool to look at.
that's great. That's great. And you are always welcome
that's
here to have a look at material, our material.
Ah,
Yeah,
I would love to visit. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, with this, I guess we can end our today's session if there's no any other question from audience. And would you
yeah.
like to say something, Razika or Akhilesh?
Yeah, just to thank Rosa for this
Yeah.
contribution. Okay, and how to say it, I started now to see, how to say it, I have my point of view on the South Africa. I think it's the moment or the time to compare with North Africa, where I'm
Oh, for
working with
sure.
Mohammed. Okay. Yeah, I think we have a lot of similarities in lithics. Yeah.
Oh, I
So
think
thank
so.
you so much. Yeah. So thank
Pleasure.
you for your
Thank you for
time.
having me.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Thank you
we
so
will
much
be
for
in
coming to
touch.
our, yeah. Thank you so
Yeah,
Okay.
much for
absolutely.
Thank
talking on
you.
our platform.
Me too. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
See you again.
Bye. See you again.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.